Alessandra Harris. In this Black History Month series, second video, I want to discuss DEI, the term that recently has been blamed for things like airplane crashes and leading to inequality and what some call anti-white racism. I recently posted on the social media account Threads that if you oppose DEI, you should have to use the full phrase instead of the acronym. You should say, I oppose diversity, equity, and inclusion because that's what DEI stands for. After I posted that, someone commented, I, a brown Hispanic, oppose diversity, equity, and inclusion. DEI is used to defeat the concept of merit and performance, which is against the right to equality and justice granted in any civilized society, end quote. I think that response is a common misconception that many people in America, including President Trump, have. So in this video, I want to give examples of why DEI was needed in the first place. I'm going to talk about anti-Black racism in the United States and how only since the Civil Rights Act of 1965 has this country tried to remedy the anti-Black racism and how that allowed other people of color to also access the fruits of American society in what is now our multiracial society. For far too long, Black Americans' historical importance has been a footnote in United States history. But Black people who were enslaved literally and figuratively helped build this country. The profits from the enslaved African Americans' forced labor and their innovation fueled the Industrial Revolution, creating what has become the richest and most powerful country today. According to Yale historian David W. Blight, quote, the nearly 4 million American slaves were worth some $3.5 billion, equivalent to $42 trillion today, making them the largest single financial asset in the entire U.S. economy, worth more than all manufacturing and railroads combined, end quote. Yet, while Black Americans who are descendants of people who were enslaved make up 14% of the American population today, they own 2% of the wealth in America. In contrast, white Americans, who make up 60% of the American population today, own 90% of the wealth. The descendants of Black Americans who were brutally exploited and denied the fruits of their labor are now calling for what is rightfully owed to them. The Reconstruction era that followed the Civil War lasted from 1865 to 1877 and was led by the government and intended to enforce and exercise the new rights granted to African Americans in the United States who were newly freed. The federal government sent troops to southern states to maintain a military presence as millions of Black freedmen attempted to claim their rights. General William T. Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15, issued on January 16, 1865, ordered the redistribution of 400,000 acres of land to the newly freed Black population. Black men were elected to local and state office, including the Senate, opening a path to political power. Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau, which provided food, housing, legal assistance, and medical aid to newly anticipated citizens, and founded the building of thousands of schools for Black children and young people. During this time, a number of historically Black colleges and universities, known as HBCUs, were founded, including Morehouse College, Fisk University, and Howard University. A savings bank was also founded with the goal of helping 4 million Black people who had been enslaved gain financial freedom. General Sherman's order, however, was overturned in the fall of 1865 when Andrew Johnson became president after Lincoln's assassination. Johnson returned the confiscated lands to the white planters who were in the Confederacy and originally owned them. By January 1867, all the black Union troops were removed from the South, and in their absence, white people terrorized the black population in the southern states in what historian Annette Gordon Reed called a, quote, slow motion genocide, end quote. In one area of Texas, more than 1,000 black people were murdered by white people between 1865 and 1868. More African Americans were massacred in Memphis, New Orleans, Hamburg, South Carolina, and Colfax, Louisiana. When black people tried to assert their autonomy, either by leaving an employer, demanding payment for their labor, or even traveling to visit family, they were at risk of being killed, imprisoned, or violently attacked by white people. Though more than 60,000 African Americans had deposited over $3 million into the savings bank created by the Freedmen's Bureau, in 1874 the bank failed and depositors lost a majority of their savings. When one African American community resisted lynching, it resulted in the destruction of one of the most prosperous black communities in the United States, known as Black Wall Street, located in the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Between 1910 and 1920, the African American population in Tulsa County had increased from 2,754 people to 10,903,000. Black people migrated there for the increased employment opportunities. Though segregation restricted African American opportunities, in Greenwood, the opportunity for people to put money back into their community created financial autonomy for the black community. By 1920, the community businesses in Greenwood included restaurants, hotels, movie theaters, billiard halls, and car repair shops. There was also a large professional population with 19 black physicians/surgeons, 8 lawyers, 6 pharmacists, and 3 dentists. White newspapers often derogatorily referred to the African American district as Little Africa or Niggertown. On the morning of May 30th, 1921, Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black teenager who worked at a shoeshine stand in front of the Drexel building in Tulsa, rode the elevator to the 3rd floor with a 17-year-old white operator named Sarah Page to use the restroom. Different rumors circulated about what occurred on the elevator, and the following day, Rowland was arrested and accused of assaulting Page. A white newspaper published sensational claims about the assault on the front page, and a mob of thousands of white people gathered at the courthouse where Rowland was held. Fearing he would be lynched, black residents also gathered at the courthouse, and a single gunshot was fired. What ensued was one of the bloodiest racial attacks in U.S. history. Tulsa police deputized white men and armed them with guns, multiplying the police force overnight. In the early morning of June 1, 1921, all hell broke loose as white law enforcement and residents unleashed their fury on the black Greenwood district. Biplanes dropped fiery turpentine bombs from the night skies onto the rooftops, the first aerial bombing of an American city in history. A furious mob of thousands of white men then surged over black homes, killing, destroying, and snatching everything from dining room furniture to piggy banks. Arsonists reportedly waited for white women to fill bags with household loot before setting black homes on fire. Tulsa police officers were identified by eyewitnesses as setting fire to black homes, shooting residents, and stealing. Eyewitnesses saw women being chased from their homes naked, some with babies in their arms, as volleys of shots were fired at them. Several black people were tied to cars and dragged through the streets. Black residents valiantly fought back but were outmanned and outarmed. The governor declared martial law and called in the National Guard. Though not a single white person was arrested, over 6,000 Black residents were detained and held, some for as long as 8 days. As a result of the mob violence, 35 city blocks of the African American district were burned to the ground, including an estimated 1,256 homes, along with virtually every business and community structure, including churches, schools, businesses, a hospital, and a library. More than 800 people were injured, as many as 300 people died, and thousands remained unaccounted for. The white city officials designated the violence destruction a race riot, preventing insurance companies from their requirement of having to pay benefits to the Black residents of Greenwood, whose homes and businesses were destroyed. 10,000 residents became homeless. The grand jury that was formed to investigate the cause of the riot laid blame not on the white people, but on Greenwood's Black community, which had acted to protect one of its residents from lynching. In their report, they said, "We find that certain propaganda and more or less agitation had been going on among the colored population for some time. This agitation resulted in the accumulation of firearms among the people and the storage of ammunition, all of which led them as a people to believe in equal rights, social equality, and their ability to demand the same." End quote. Walter White, a Black man from the NAACP, came to Tulsa after the massacre to investigate. He perceived that the Black district posed an economic threat to the white residents, concluding that the Black prosperity of Greenwood contributed to the riot. He wrote, quote, "The fact has caused a bitter resentment on the part of the lower order of whites, who feel these colored men, members of an inferior race, are exceedingly presumptuous in achieving greater economic prosperity than they who are members of a divinely ordered superior race." End quote. To this day, reparations have never been paid to any Black people who lost everything in the massacre. In order for us to understand today why such a large percentage of low-income African Americans still live in segregated neighborhoods, attend underperforming and under-resourced public schools, have fewer resources and wealth, and are excessively policed and incarcerated, we need to revisit the forgotten history of anti-Black racism in housing and land ownership. In the book, Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, Richard Rothstein provides evidence showing how, until the last quarter of the 20th century, racially explicit policies of federal, state, and local governments defined where whites and African Americans should live. Today's residential segregation in the North, South, Midwest, and West is not the unintended consequence of individual choices and of otherwise well-meaning law or regulation, but of unhidden public policy that explicitly segregated every metropolitan area in the United States. Without our government's purposeful imposition of racial segregation, the other causes, such as private prejudice, white flight when Black people moved into a neighborhood, real estate steering, bank redlining, income differences, and self-segregations still would have existed, but with far less opportunity for expression. Segregation by intentional government action is not de facto. Rather, it is what courts call de jure, segregation by law and public policy. During the Great Depression in the 1930s and into into the early 1950s, there was a serious shortage of housing for both white and African American working and middle class families. In response, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal created public housing for civilians that either segregated them by race or that completely excluded Black people. One such federal housing project effort was created by the Public Works Administration, PWA, with the goal of alleviating the national housing shortage by creating construction jobs. Of the 47 housing projects, 17 were assigned to Black people, 6 had segregating buildings for Blacks and whites, and the remaining 24 were whites only. Though Congress ended the PWA program in 1937, the newly created U.S. Housing Authority, USHA, continued the government's practice of segregating neighborhoods. After Congress adopted the Lanham Act in 1940 to finance housing for workers in defense industries, the government provided war housing only for white people or segregated Black people in housing. By the time World War II ended, the Lanham Act, PWA, and USHA programs had resulted in residential segregation throughout the country. Housing authorities across the nation constructed housing developments that were whites or Blacks only. After the Second World War, with millions of Americans returning home from fighting abroad, the lack of housing reached crisis level. In 1949, when President Harry Truman proposed new public housing legislation, the Senate and House rejected amendments that would have prohibited segregation and racial discrimination and passed the Housing Act, which permitted local authorities to continue segregating housing projects by race. Though African Americans desperately needed housing, the government segregated them in high-rise projects that left them with little access to jobs and social services in white communities. Massive housing projects in Chicago, Philadelphia, New York City, and St. Louis were undertaken. In other states, such as California, Iowa, Minnesota, Virginia, and Wisconsin, constitutional amendments were adopted in the 1950s that allowed middle-class white communities to systemically veto low-income public housing proposals. An investigative report in 1984 of federally funded developments in 47 metropolitan areas done in the Dallas Morning News described just how effective and long-lasting the government policies of segregating housing projects were. The reporters found that the nation's nearly 10 million public housing tenants were almost always segregated by race, and that every predominantly white-occupied project had facilities, amenities, services, and maintenance that were superior to what was found in predominantly Black-owned projects. To accelerate the move of white Americans from public housing projects to buying and owning their own homes, the federal government made changes. The majority of working and middle-class families could not afford to put 50% down nor repay the mortgage in 5 to 7 years, as was the standard at that time. To remedy this, in 1933, Roosevelt's administration created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC. In addition to purchasing existing mortgages that were at risk of default and foreclosure and issuing new mortgages with a new repayment schedule of 15 to 25 years, the HOLC loans were amortized, so the monthly payments went toward the principal balance. This allowed working and middle-class homeowners to gain equity and profit from homeownership. Yet, these federal loans were not available to all Americans. The HOLC assessed the risk of potential homeowners and their potential neighborhoods using local real estate agents to make the appraisals. Mostly white realtors were tasked with gauging risks, something negatively impacting African Americans' ability to become homeowners. The HOLC created color-coded maps of every metropolitan area in the nation, with the safest neighborhoods colored green and the riskiest colored red. A neighborhood earned a red color if African Americans lived in it, even if it was a solid middle-class neighborhood of single-family homes. For example, in St. Louis, the white middle-class suburb of Ladue was colored green because, according to an HOLC appraiser in 1914, it had not a single foreigner or Negro. The similarly middle-class suburb area of Lincoln Terrace was colored red because it had little or no value today due to the colored element now controlling the district. Although the HOLC did not always decline to rescue homeowners in neighborhoods colored red on its map, i.e., this is where the term redlining comes from, the maps had a huge impact and put the federal government on record as judging that African Americans, simply because of their race, were poor risks. A year later, in 1934, Congress and Roosevelt's administration created the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, which insured bank mortgages and covered 80% of purchase prices, had terms of 20 years, and were fully amortized. The FHA conducted its own appraisals to determine eligibility for potential buyers of the property. Because the FHA's appraisal standards included a whites-only requirement, racial segregation now became an official requirement of the Federal Mortgage Insurance Program. Properties in racially integrated neighborhoods, or even all-white neighborhoods in close proximity to black ones that could possibly integrate, were considered too risky for an FHA loan. To further cement the growth of all-white suburbs, the FHA discouraged banks from making any loans at all in urban neighborhoods rather than newly built suburbs. Throughout the country, the FHA policy refused to guarantee mortgages for African Americans regardless of their income or creditworthiness. The newly established Veterans Administration also began to guarantee mortgages for returning servicemen and adopted the racist FHA housing policies. By 1950s, the FHA and VA together were insuring half of all new mortgages nationwide. Thousands of suburban subdivisions in every metropolitan area across the country were mass-produced with the FHA or VA-imposed condition that these suburbs be all white. Similarly, a commonplace commitment in deed clauses was the promise to never sell or rent to a person who was African American. It wasn't until President John F. Kennedy issued an executive order in 1962 prohibiting the use of federal funds to support racial discrimination in housing that the FHA stopped financing subdivision developments whose builders would not sell to black buyers. Millions more white people still benefit from the overtly racist federal housing policies begun after the New Deal. 98% of the loans issued by the Federal Housing Administration from 1934 through 1962 went to white borrowers. The government's policies and programs in the 20th century to segregate neighborhoods and deny loans to black Americans resulted in fewer black Americans being able to own homes, accumulate wealth from homeownership, and pass that wealth down. To this day, African Americans still have the lowest home ownership rates at 43.3%, compared to 72.1% of white Americans, 61.7% of Asian Americans, and 51.1% of Hispanic Americans. According to a study by Lending Tree, Black Americans are 15% of the combined population of the 50 largest metro areas, but they own 10% of the owner-occupied homes in those cities. White Americans account for 64% of the population in those cities, but own 76% of the owner-occupied houses. In addition to housing, another serious type of segregation against African Americans was employment discrimination. Although civil rights protests, marches, and boycotts were held in southern states like Alabama, North Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee, segregation and racial discrimination were not only southern problems, they were entrenched in federal and business policy throughout the country. After the Second World War, American manufacturing soared, and a large number of African Americans and white working class men migrated from the South to the upper Midwest for union wage jobs in the auto and steel industries. Black workers began to organize for both better working conditions and an end to racial segregation and oppression there as well. When African Americans who left the South entered a northern labor market, federal, state, and local governments collaborated with private employers to ensure they were paid less and treated worse than the white counterparts. Social Security, minimum wage protection, and the recognition of labor unions all excluded from coverage occupations in which African Americans predominated, such as agriculture and domestic service. State and local governments behaved similarly. The first National New Deal program, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, adopted in 1933, disproportionately spent its funds on unemployed whites, frequently refused to permit African Americans to take any but the least skilled jobs, and even in those paid them less than the officially stipulated wage. Labor unions, such as the American Federation of Labor, denied membership to African Americans, or only allowed them to be hired in janitorial or other low-wage positions. During World War II, most unions, such as the Marine Laborers Union, which had 30,000 members, and the Steamfitters Union, which had 17,000 members, had National Labor Relations Board certified agreements that companies could not hire without a union referral, and that unions would not refer African Americans. In the instance of the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers, iron shipbuilders, and helpers, when there were not enough white workers to fill shipyard positions, the Boilermakers established segregated auxiliary union chapters, whose black members had to pay dues but could not file grievances or vote in union elections. They received fringe benefits worth about half what white members received, but could not supervise whites or receive union support to advance to better paying jobs. For 30 years, the government recognized segregated unions and tolerated white unions that denied membership to African Americans until President Kennedy banned the practice in 1962. The Civil Rights Movement was a response to American society's glass ceiling that kept the majority of Black Americans from full participation and benefit in civic and social life. As a result of over 400 years of oppression and inequality and persistent structural, institutional, and interpersonal racism, African American households in 2016 had a median net worth of $17,600, which is only 1/10 of white household net worth of $171,000. That means, on average, that for every dollar the middle white household holds in wealth, measured by assets like homes, cash savings, and retirement funds, the middle Black household possesses a mere 10 cents. According to a 2019 McKinsey & Company report on income inequality, Black Americans can expect to earn up to $1 million less than white Americans over their lifetimes. This discrepancy is the product of a lifetime of diverging circumstances. For instance, without a resource-rich community of family of origin, individual families may improve their economic positions with their earnings. A family can increase its earning potential by attaining more education to develop its store of human capital. However, Black families face serious obstacles on the journey through the education system and converting education to stable employment that provides rising incomes. Obstacles that reduce lifetime earning potential come in the form of poor school quality, differential treatment in the criminal justice system, workplace discrimination, career selection, and a lack of role models who can guide professional career advancements. DEI has its roots in the 1960s anti-discrimination legislative movement when laws like the Equal Pay Act of 1963, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967 addressed labor issues based on protected classes. Companies and the governmental organizations had to comply with these anti-discrimination laws, and the DEI movement stems from these efforts to continue creating equitable workplaces and schools. The kind of ethos of these initiatives was to go beyond just avoiding discrimination and to actively changing organizations so that they were more welcoming and more inclusive, particularly for Black people, for women, for disabled people, and other people of color. DEI initiatives are intended to address and correct discriminatory policies or practices that I just mentioned above that were found within workplaces, governmental agencies, housing, and other places. According to ABC News, some examples of DEI initiatives include implementing accessibility measures for people with disabilities, addressing gender pay inequity between men and women, expanding recruitment practices among underrepresented demographics, and holding anti-discrimination trainings and more. However, now, under the Trump administration, the government argues that DEI creates and then amplifies prejudicial hostility and exacerbates interpersonal conflict. Read one press release on Trump's DEI executive orders. One executive order directs the Office of Management and Budget to terminate all federal programs related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, ending any consideration of DEI factors, goals, or policies, and curate list of economic and social costs of these programs. This includes any environmental justice or equity-related programming. Another executive order directs federal contractors to cease promoting diversity, taking affirmative action, and encourages the private sector to follow suit. The order revokes several decades old or years old executive actions, including the 1965 Equal Employment Opportunity Order that prohibited hiring discrimination by federal contractors, and its amendments that expanded professional development, data collection, and retention opportunities, and the 2011 order that required federal agencies to develop strategies to identify and remove barriers to equal employment opportunity. The order also explicitly revokes a 1994 order to develop environmental justice strategies that address disproportionately high health and environmental impacts faced by low-income or Black and minority communities. In other words, the Trump administration wants to roll back all the progress that had been made to make America more equitable, more diverse, and more inclusive. As I have hoped I have demonstrated in this video, Black people have had centuries of being oppressed, exploited, discriminated against, and denied the opportunities white people have. Black people are still suffering the consequences. Reversing diversity, equity, and inclusion will only lead to many more years of racism, discrimination, and inequality, particularly for Black women, for Black men, for all women, and for those who are disabled. If you like this video, please share and subscribe, and I'll see you next week for my Black History Month series.